Often in my conversations with statists, they'll ask me, well, what happens if there's no government and this happens and that happens? So I have a few questions for statists themselves. What happens if there's a government and they commit genocide? Or what happens if there's a government and they put people in cages for victimless crimes like lemonade stands without licenses, or the drug war, or tax evasion? Or what happens if there's a government and they initiate violence against peaceful people, maybe something like Waco or Ruby Ridge? Or what happens if there's a government and they start a war based on lies, like the Gulf of Tonkin or Pearl Harbor or the Lusitania or Iraq, or they lie to NATO about invading Afghanistan? Or what happens if there's a government and they kill a bunch of civilians in a war and then form blockades around countries and starve those civilians for decades after the war is over? Or what happens if there's a government and they disarm the populace and then become tyrannical? What happens if there's a government and they don't represent their constituents? Or what happens if they don't count the votes in an election? Or what happens if there's a government and then they just lie and the politicians don't tell the truth about what's going on? What happens if there's a government and they give themselves a monopoly on printing money and delegate that to the Federal Reserve? Or what happens if there's a government and they try to violently dominate people's behavior through regulation of the economy? Or what happens if there's a government and they violate people's rights, like two people want to get together, trade goods, but the FDA or OSHA stops them from doing so? Or what happens if there's a government and they steal trillions through taxation? Or what happens if there's a government and the Federal Reserve they've given a monopoly on currency to causes a recession through guaranteed loans, mortgage-backed securities, bailouts, and interest rate manipulation? Or what happens if there's a government and they falsely imprison someone? Or what happens if there's a government and they devalue the currency, which hurts those with fixed incomes and all the savings they have, and they've already given themselves a monopoly on the currency? Or what happens if there's a government and they regulate you out of business and only big companies that can afford to comply create oligopolies because they're the only ones with the lawyers and the resources and the time and energy to do so? What happens if they regulate you out of business? Or what happens if there's a government and they monopolize compulsory education, forcing people to fund state propaganda and force children to attend? Or what happens if you get a case like Warren versus District of Columbia, where the state then says they have no obligation to defend or protect the citizenry? Or what happens if there's a government and they have Social Security, but then they just don't pay it out, as they said they would in 1960 with Fleming versus Nestor? What happens if there's a government and they implement sanctions that kill hundreds of thousands of people? These are just a number of thoughts I have and things I would ask statists. Maybe another one that comes to mind is, what happens if there's an attack and they blame Al-Qaeda and then they fund Al-Qaeda in Syria and Libya, and then they're Al-Qaeda's Air Force in Yemen? I just know statists are very curious about what would happen if this and that in the absence of a state. I'm just hoping I could get some answers to these questions. Thank you for listening.